Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the 10th game of the World Championship match between Lasker and Capablanca, a game that José Raúl himself considered one of the very best of his career. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment. Alright, let's travel back in time to Havana 1921. Lasker has the white pieces and starts the game by pushing his queen's pawn. Capablanca responds with pawn to d5. Lasker chooses the queen's gambit, but Capablanca declines it. From here, both players fight step by step for control of the center. White pins the knight, and black calmly defends against the pin. Lasker opens the diagonal for his light-squared bishop, while Capablanca castles. Knight f3, knight d7. Both sides are battling for control of the key e5 square. Lasker takes control of e4 with the queen on c2. Capablanca strikes back, creating pawn tension in the center. Lasker brings his rook to the d file, but Capablanca quickly swings his queen a5, putting pressure on the knight. Capablanca shifts his queen over to a5, pinning the knight. Meanwhile, white completes the development of the light pieces and creates the threat of capturing on h7 thanks to the lurking bishop. So Capablanca, with tempo, removes the pawn from attack while countering the black-squared bishop. After the retreat, he unloads the center, first exchanging on d4, then striking on c4, isolating the central pawn. Now, as we know, the isolated pawn has both advantages and drawbacks. The upside, it gives extra space, opens files for the rooks, and can lead to attacking chances in the center or even on the king side. But the weakness lies in the fact that no other pawns can defend it, and the fewer pieces remain on the board, the weaker this isolated pawn becomes. That means black has two main strategic goals. First, to prevent white from pushing d5 and freeing the isolator, and second, to trade as many pieces as possible and head into an endgame where this weakness can be fully exploited. Capablanca strikes at the bishop, and after it retreats, he calmly plays bishop to d7, preparing to place it on the long diagonal and strengthen his control over the central d5 square. After castling, he brings a rook to the open file, putting more pressure on Lasker's knight. Lasker activates his second knight, but the moment he does, black counterattacks the rook and then firmly blockades the isolated pawn. As the Grandmaster Aaron Nimzowitsch once said, the isolated pawn is a criminal that should be kept under lock and key. Here, Lasker had a strong exchange option. Try to find the move that the world chess champion missed. And the move is bishop takes f6. The point is subtle but deadly. If black recaptures with the knight, then white has the tactical shot knight to g6. After the pawn captures, white smashes through with pawn takes on e6, a fork. He wins the rook and then scoops up the bishop on e7, gaining a huge material advantage. Because of this danger, black would have to recapture on f6 with the bishop instead, but then white could strike on d5, grab the isolated pawn, activate the queen, and even threaten a nasty knight jump to g4, eyeing the king side. Likely, black would have to sacrifice the exchange on e5 to hold things together. In that scenario, white would stand with a lasting strategic edge, an extra pawn, in freer piece activity, while black's light-squared bishop would remain restricted. But instead, in the actual game, the reigning champion Emanuel Lasker chose a completely unnecessary exchange, and with that, white's chances for an advantage disappeared. After the capture on d5, the bishop is hanging, so Lasker trades again on e7. Then white attacks the bishop. The bishop retreats to c6, and Emanuel exchanges his knight for the bishop. After a series of simplifications, the position slightly favors black. True, they now have two isolated pawns, but in this setup, black's pawns are not as vulnerable as white's isolated pawn on d4, as Capablanca himself noted in the comments. White now attacks the queen with rook to e5. The queen slides back to b6, and Lasker avoids exchanging the strongest pieces. Black, however, begins pressing down on the isolated pawn on d4. Here, Lasker should have tried the active knight to a4, hitting the queen and also the c5 square, which is already under pressure. Instead, he chose the passive knight to e2. Just defend. Capablanca doubles up along the d-file, and Lasker doesn't resist this exchange. Black consolidates. They keep the open file, Their pieces are perfectly placed, and their only weakness, the pawn on a7, cannot realistically be attacked since it's such an unusual target. As Capablanca wrote, Lasker parked the bus in front of my goal. White sinks into a deep defensive stance, while Capablanca keeps pressing against the isolated pawn. Queen to d2, stepping out of the rook's attack. Capablanca keeps up the pressure against the pawn on d4. In response to b3, he plays h5, fixing the knight on f5. Lasker still doesn't give up hope of driving that knight away. Capablanca then locks down the kingside with h4, making the move g4 a serious weakening of White's position. After queen to d3, Capablanca plays rook to c6 to activate the queen. White, meanwhile, continues to just sit tight, forced to make nothing but waiting moves. Black, without any rush, prepares the advance. Queen to b4, and after the king slides over to g1, Capablanca launches his flank pawn. With this queenside push, Black not only eliminates the isolated pawn, but also creates a second weakness for White on b3, in addition to the pawn on d4. Lasker tries to trade heavy pieces to reduce the attacking potential, but Capablanca doesn't mind the exchanges at all. He then isolates the b-pawn and begins a systematic siege. White defends it, but Capablanca calmly places his rook on the open file. With the queens off the board, a kingside breakthrough isn't so dangerous. After an en passant capture and rook to e2, Lasker moves his knight out of danger, attacking the rook. The rook slides over to c2. Knight d1, Capablanca redirects his knight to the queenside, aiming to pick off one of White's weak pawns. Black calmly prepares their offensive. White plays queen b1. After queen b4 and the king's move to g1, Capablanca pushes his flank pawn, starting an advance on the queenside. With this, Black not only gets rid of their isolated pawn, but also creates a second isolani for the opponent on b3, in addition to the pawn on d4. Lasker tries to exchange heavy pieces to reduce the number of attackers, but Capablanca has no objection to the trade. He then isolates the pawn along the b-file and begins its systematic siege. The white pawn is defended. Capablanca places his rook on the open file. With no queens left on the board, opening the king's side is not so dangerous. At the same time, White hopes to give their king a little freedom of action. After an en passant capture and the continuation rook a2, Lasker pulls his knight out of danger, attacking the rook. The rook shifts to c2, and after the reply knight d1, Capablanca maneuvers his knight toward the queen side to target one of the weak. So the rook is attacked, but it gives a check along the first rank, and the king steps to f2. Black continues with knight c6, and after the reply knight d1, he positions his rook behind the pawn. As a result, the isolated pawn on b3 falls, since there is no defense against the move knight a5. Lasker played king e2, but overlooked a small combination. After rook b3, the pawn cannot be taken because of a knight fork, and Black ends up with two extra pawns in the knight endgame. White continues to stand still, awaiting their fate. Black prefers to keep the rooks on the board to maintain pressure against the isolated pawn on d4. Play continues with knight c3, knight e7, knight e2, knight f5. Black seizes space on the king side and places all of their pieces on the most optimal squares. The rook checked the first rank with rook b2 in rook f2, completely tying down the white king. As a result of the last moves, White's pieces are utterly passive. Black now has the time to maneuver their king wherever they please, as noted by José Raúl. And we now watch how the great Cuban converts his advantage. His king marches into the center. After rook d3, Black gives another check, then follows with rook a2, and after rook d3, the pawns begin to advance. Thus, Black creates a passed pawn in the center of the board. With White effectively playing without active pieces, in without an active king, the victory becomes straightforward. After king c5, then d4, and following rook c1 with king d5, on move 68, Emanuel Lasker was signed. If you enjoy this instructive game, don't forget to support the channel with a like. Subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown of classic masterpieces, and drop a comment with your thoughts about Capablanca's technique.